On this video, I'm going to be going through what I think are the 10 greatest drummers in history. Now, the key word here is in history. In the history of the drumming, I think these 10 drummers did stuff on the drums that changed the shape of drums. Now, of course, we do only have 10, and even I'm thinking, oh my God, I've missed this drummer out and I've missed that drummer out. So I do apologise before we start. You know, if I've really made some errors, I will come back to this video in the future, as I always do. But here I'm going to try and nail it and put a stake in the ground of the 10 most important drummers in history. But before we start, I think it would be it's important that I explain something about this, the drum kit, because the drum kit is not an instrument. I know many musicians think this, guitarists will say this, but I don't mean it like that. This is actually a collection of instruments. The basic two instruments on a drum kit are the bass drum and the snare drum. The bass drum and the snare drum come from marching music, and originally they were played separately. So if you imagine a marching band, as they march down the road playing their stuff, the bass drum would be banging the bass drum, wouldn't they? You know, you imagine. So that's what you've got going on, and then there's another guy coming on, and he's got the old snare drum around the old neck, like some sort of army military drummer. And a lot of the technique, especially in America, comes from drummers that were playing in the Civil War. And a few decades later, in the 1920s, a drum maker and a drum teacher called Sanford Moeller visited these old people's homes, and he chatted to these old guys and looked at the technique they were playing, and that really creates the foundation of drum technique in the 20th century. One of the things that gets forgotten when people talk about the history of music is how important technique is, and how the approaches that are developed in a certain region influence how the music sounds, because people start to utilize that technique to create the music. So yeah, we've got the bass drum there, and then we got the other guy. We've been playing traditional grip. This grip, of course, was related so you can play on an angle on a drum that's slung around your neck, you know. So you would have the bass drum and then the sort of snare drum backing it up like this. Played like that, it sounds incredibly militaristic, all right? In America, in New Orleans, various bands started to play the music of Sousa, and Sousa's music was syncopated. And by syncopated, it means that the beat on the snare drum was being played on the 2 and 4. We think, because of course there's no recordings at this point. But if I was to accent on the 2 and 4, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we get this sort of sound. So if you had a band and you were playing marches in New Orleans at the end of the 19th century, the problem you've got is you've got to hire 2 people to play the bass drum and the snare drum until our first drummer on the list comes along, and he's probably someone you haven't heard of. My number 1 drummer on this list is a guy called Dee Dee Chandler. Now, we don't know much about him, and there is only 1 photograph of him, and it looks like this. Right, but that photograph is important. That was taken in 1897. And if you look down at the bass drum that he's sat in front of, you will notice that there's a whole homemade bass drum pedal, right? So he is playing now these 2 at the same time, like I was just doing. Suddenly, this changes the nature of groups. Rather than being a marching band and walking down the road, now you sit down and you're playing together. And I think this is what creates the idea of the jazz group. Now, how could Dee Dee Chandler do this? Because at the time, he was incredibly virtuoso of this, and there are records of people saying that his coordination was like a thing unto itself. That people would go and see the band just to see Dee Dee Chandler and what he was doing coordination-wise. Now, African Americans on the plantations weren't allowed to have drums, so they invented a thing called ham bone.
So everybody do ham bone, like ham bone, where you been around the world and going back again. Ham bone, ain't you ashamed to be your wife, what a walking cane. All right, now the bow slap, you go pretty much like. Ham bone, where you been? Around the world and going back again. Ham bone, ain't you ashamed for beating your wife with a walking cane? Ham bone.
Right, so those skills may have well been the underpinning of this sort of approach. But of course, we're not too sure. But Dee Dee Chandler is definitely the guy that does this, and that allows you to sort of, got all that going on now by one person. Now you notice here I was actually tapping the hi-hats. Now, in a military band, you would have had two guys walking along with the bass drum and snare drum, and they would be clashing those cymbals together. You often get those little monkeys, or used to, that would do that and clash the cymbals together. Now, the hi-hat is basically a mechanical device to do that, so I can clash these cymbals together. Now, if I play this like it was a military band, you would get this sound. As soon as you play the drums like that, what is interesting is that the drums sound correct. Now, most kids, when they get a drum kit, they go, well, this doesn't sound like, Dave Grohl or whatever it is, because the drums have evolved over 100 years, but their basic sound, they're basically designed to create that sound, okay? Now, the hi-hat didn't come along until the 1920s. So when we start to listen to the early recordings of jazz, now you might want to think, why am I talking about jazz? Because rock drumming, pop drumming, reggae drumming, soul drumming, all drumming is related to jazz. It's birthed in jazz. It doesn't exist anywhere else. When jazz started to become popular in the 1920s, the jazz rhythm sections were picked up, and these drummers were dropped onto country sessions, they were dropped onto blues sessions, and those styles of music never had drummers on. And so the swing of jazz, now this is a very contentious thing here. Recently, I did an interview with a guy called Truth Savior, and I explained what swing was. I said it's based upon triplets, and that's a universal idea. And there's been people not only disagree, but they've ridiculed me on this. So I am at some point going to do a video where I explain how swing developed, and I'm going to bring a whole bunch of different influences in. But the swing, which is basically the swing rhythm, is rather than having this, if you think of time, that's not swung. Swung is this. It's based upon a triplet rhythm. So if I speed that up, so that is now swung marching music. That's what I was just doing then. And that's what starts to develop. But as I was saying, the hi-hat doesn't come until 1925. And when they first invent it, logically, they put the cymbals down here. They see it as another pedal. And drummers start playing it. Now, why do they start playing the hi-hats? Why do they become important? Because if you if you ever watch a drummer, the basic pulse of the time and the characteristic of the music is on the hi-hat, which we said wasn't invented till 1925. All the drummers up then were playing on a snare drum. Now, there's a problem with this, because when recording's invented, we've got cylinder recording, and we've got a needle going around a cylinder. And as soon as a drummer went into a recording studio, which was probably a hotel somewhere with some big megaphone-shaped microphone in the corner, and starts to go... Once they start doing all that, the needle just jumps around, so the guys would say, we can't do that. And so there's another aspect of drumming. If we look at early drummers like Baby Dodds, and Baby Dodds is not on my list, right? And maybe he should be, but Baby Dodds is one of the most influential drummers in the 1920s, played with Louis Armstrong, and really was a virtuoso, basically, at this style of drumming, hi-hatless drumming. Now, Baby Dodds had come out of silent cinema, so he was playing in these little orchestras that were playing and watching the music, and he was doing thunder and lightning and all that type of thing. And he would have had a table with sound contraptions on it, and these contraptions, the name for that was shortened to traps, and they made different sounds. So when you go to the studio, they go, well, I haven't got that, but I got some coconuts, because I'd have to do the horse, you know, when the horse is coming on, go blop, blop. So they would start to play the coconuts because they were quieter. So a lot of those early Louis Armstrongs, I haven't got a coconut, but I've got the rim of this. You might have got this. That's all that's on those records. It's really light touches. And of course, when the hi-hats come in, people start to take, rather than going... I imagine that was sort of the jazz rhythms that had developed by the 1920s. So they eventually moved it over to the hi-hat. Now here I'm playing the standard ting-tingling swing beat that comes from jazz. I'm not going to explain where that comes from on this video. It would take me an hour. It would become so involved. Just to give you an idea, some of it could well just come from the way the stick actually acts. If you let the stick bounce on its own accord. See that there? So it could be... I'm not playing that. It could just be gravity that developed the swing beat, but there's a lot more to it than that. But when the swing beat gets transferred to the hi-hats, this is a groundbreaking moment. Now, the guy that did that is number 2 on my list, and that's Joe Jones, who was famous for playing in the Count Basie rhythm section. And Joe Jones sort of, he would play the hi-hats here. Like that. And you see what I'm doing here is, rather than using the hi-hat pedal to open it and getting this sound, that sound, he actually did it with his fingers. Now this was groundbreaking, this was. The Count Basie rhythm section was a bass player, double bass, a piano, Count Basie, a guitar, Freddie Green, and Joe Jones on drums. That's where the rhythm section is really established, that we're going to see in rock bands and rock and roll bands and all that. Before then, the New Orleans lineup was basically marching instruments, which were secondary, and what was most important was the front line, which would be trumpet playing the melody, a trombone or maybe a tuba playing the bass end, and a clarinet weaving over the top. And you can play New Orleans jazz with just those three. You don't need the drums. So the transference of the time to the hi-hats is massively important. Joe Jones, I believe, is the greatest drummer that ever lived. If you watch him play, not only was he an incredible innovator, but he is the most elegant and beautiful drummer you will ever see. And it's a window to a lost art of drumming, a lost art of snare drumming. And the show that he puts on, the way he plays, a lot of things like stick tricks, although he did it very gracefully, and the way he would play absolutely every every part of the kit. If you watch his drum solo, we would often do something like he'd play actually with 2 sticks, wouldn't he? Because he'd have his hand there. So if you go. All of this stuff's incredible. So go and check Joe Jones. He really is the greatest drummer. And rather than focusing on speed and all that type, and if you listen to his crush rolls, they're so beautiful. And some of the stuff he does is so fast and yet so quiet. He really is the greatest. I tell you that now. So Joe Jones is number 2. And so the groove we've basically got now was often this. With Joe Jones, the Count Basie group, he would be playing, holding the hi-hat here, feathering the bass drum. That's really quietly. And the big band pushes, he would kick on the snare drum like that. And then if he needs to open up, then you go. And we're into styles of music that I could sort of emulate, but I'm no master of this. You know, I'm a rock drummer basically, and that's the point, is that this is slowly moving to somewhere else. The big bands cost a lot of money. Obviously, you'd got a lot of musicians playing arrangements. These arrangements had come from the great Fletcher Henderson, another very important musician, and the drummers were powering that. You know, and live, I imagine these guys were really playing loud. And in the 30s, you start to see Gene Krupa come out, and then later on in the 40s, Buddy Rich comes out, and they're all really high-powered drummers. Now, they're not on this list, but in those drummers, we start to see the idea of the drum solo, and the drum solo really inspires that generation of rock drummers, you know, which would be this type of thing. All that type of stuff. And, you know, they start, especially Buddy Rich, started to play between the bass drum and the snare drum, creating these sort of things. Which, of course, is the foundation of your rock drummers. Now, this idea of playing down rather than playing on top. So there's a way of seeing the drums that you just keep in time with the bass drum, and you're playing the snare drum. And that still exists to this day. When I was taught drums, I was taught like that. I'm old enough that my dad said, the first thing you have to do is learn this. And then you would practice over the top of that. And my hero, Billy Cobham, also, that's the fundamental of his playing and practice routine, was that. So you've got a pattern with your feet and you're playing on top of it. In the 1940s, because of financial restrictions, because of the war, a lot of musicians went away to the war. There was also a recording ban, so there was no recording work in America. The bands got smaller. And into that situation, the genius Charlie Parker comes in, and his rhythmical innovations, the incredibly fast syncopated sort of melodic parts that he was playing, that thing where the drummer is playing the kicks of the big band, it changes drums. And you've got the drummer number 3 on my list coming up now, which is the great Kenny Clarke, who is really the sort of father of bebop drumming. Now, what's the difference between bebop drumming and swing drumming? Well, for start, he moved the time from here over to the ride cymbal. So now we got this. And the syncopation is created by the hi-hat. That's your backbeat. And that left free the snare drum hand, the left hand, if you were left-handed, which he would have been playing like this, of course, and the bass drum, which he would then punctuate the sound using those sort of big band sort of hits that you're playing, but are now applied to this sort of bebop vocabulary, which was very much like and all that, so if you imagine. And that's the Kenny Clarke. And he was brilliant at this. Later on, Max Roach joins the band, another incredible drummer that I felt should be on, but I put Kenny Clarke, so I think he's the innovator of this. That sort of interplay between bass drum and snare drum, so now you got this. That way of playing starts to set up what I call downwards playing, which is where you're playing down the kit between your hands and your feet, and you're playing linear patterns between those. That's very important in the history of drums. So this starts to come in. In the 1940s, Jim Chapey brings out four-way coordination, which really tries to nail this, because this is hard to do. And strict bebop drumming, I find difficult because there's a whole system you've got to go to really nail it. So these jazz drummers now hit the recording industry in the 1950s and rock and roll. Now rock and roll comes out of rhythm and blues. In rhythm and blues, these shuffly swing patterns are simplified. So you might be playing a thing like this. You know, so if you go listen to Louis Jordan, it would be like funky down on buddy. You start to get those sort of shuffle patterns. Now, Earl Palmer, who is number 4, I believe, on my list. I've got it over here. My computer just keeps shutting down. I thought I'd set it so it wouldn't do this. But it is. I've got Earl Palmer at number 4, which he played on a million rock and roll records. An absolutely virtuoso drummer, proper jazz drummer, had all those chops, right? But the thing he starts to do, which is really interesting, is he takes that swing and he starts to add a backbeat on the snare drum. So rather than having this, he does this. He's doing this in the early 1950s. These records start to, go around the world. And in 1963, is it, the Beatles walk in and record one of their first recordings, which is Love Me Do. And Ringo is doing that. He's playing a shuffle, but with a backbeat. So if you imagine, oh, love me do, you know. And that big backbeat, now Ringo, of course, is my number. We'll make him the next one on the list. We'll make him my number 5. That makes it simpler. So I've got Ringo at number 5. Now Ringo pulls all this together, but the fact is that when I was doing drum clinics, I met all the great drummers, whether it was Greg Bisonet or Mark Schulman or I'm trying to think who else. There's a whole bunch of these drummers who I'd meet. And when I asked them how they got into drumming, always it was that 1964 Ed Sullivan show when they saw Ringo. And Ringo was playing backbeats, right? Now, Earl Palmer, later on, he starts to develop a very complex way of playing backbeats, where he had such chops that he would often feather. There's a lot of feathering in jazz drumming on the snare drum. And up until now, we're dealing with swing beats. Love Me Do is a swing beat, it's a shuffle. But there's another influence coming from people like Fats Domino, and this is the boogie woogie influence. And that's a lot more straightforward 16th note sort of based rhythmical vocabulary. So they would be going like Jerry Lee Lewis. And the way these jazz drummers were playing, because they would be going all that feathering here. All that feathering on here, which is very difficult, especially this time of the morning, they straightened out so you would get this. So if you think of Here Come a Knocking by Chuck Berry, which goes... And of course, John Bonham's very influenced by this, and Bonham would play these sort of... And they're hard to play. That's a lost art, I believe, in the history of drumming. So, yeah, Ringo's bringing all this, Earl Palmer's bringing all this, and this is drumming in the early 1960s. Now, of course, up until this point, the drums are being recorded in a certain way. Just like I'm recording here, this is like old school. I've just got 2 overhead mics, but I have got a bass drum mic. Now, oh God, I'm going to forget his name now. This will be terrible. The first drummer to put a microphone on the bass drum was the drummer of the Hollies, and I'll put his name up here with a photograph. Now, he's not on my list, but miking up the bass drum is, it really starts to focus on the bass drum as being a much more important instrument in the history of drumming. And around about this time, that bebop drumming has developed to such a high point that there's really 2 drummers, I would say, in the 1960s that really revolutionised the drums from a technical point of view and from a time point of view. The first being Elvin Jones. Now, I have not come across any major rock drummer, whether it's Mitch Mitchell or John Bonham or, say, Ian Pace, that wasn't influenced by the technical stuff that Elvin Jones was doing. Now, Elvin Jones had taken a lot of that sort of Buddy Rich approach, and he, if you listen to A Love Supreme, is doing a lot of solos, which is sort of like this. Very fluid time, but he's playing the Bonham triplets. We know those as Bonham triplets, but they actually go Buddy Rich, Elvin. But the thing about Elvin is the way he's keeping time, and his time is so flexible. So rather than being very strict, you know, Elvin would be like this. Now, when I play that, I'm very influenced by Jack DeJohnette with a hi-hat that's punctuating time, but Elvin never did that, and I kept thinking, this is not what Elvin did, because Elvin always kept his time here. So you get... Now, I wish I could do it. I'm trying to show you this sort of rolling time. It's almost impossible to do. Elvin would sort of flam the cymbal, the snare drum, and the bass drum. And it's like a sound you just can't get. So Elvin Jones, I believe, really influenced a whole generation of drummers, and I think the 2 guys that really lay the foundation of rock drumming, which would be Mitch Mitchell and Ginger Baker, it's coming straight out of Elvin. But there's another drummer in the 1960s, and that's, of course, Tony Williams. For me, and the way I play, being a fusion-based drummer, the father of that type of drumming is Tony Williams, and that's who I've got now at, where were we? So Elvin was number 6. So Tony's at number 7 on the list. Now, what does Tony bring in? Well, there's a whole host of stuff, really. He changes the time again with these hi-hats. So rather than putting that on the offbeat like this, he doubles that up. So and very fast. See if I can do it. It's basically and he would do stuff like this. So you start to get this stuff inside your hands, inside your fingers. Tony was very strict on going right up to the back of the fingers. I actually play fast jazz in an Elvin Jones style, which he would do. That's the Tony way. And that's the Elvin way. Tony like this. But with the hi-hat going as well. And it's really, really difficult. He also would, rather than playing around the kit on solos, sort of in that sort of... He would play between his hands and his feet. So you would get licks like this. So when Tony's played a jazz swing, rather than going, he would go. And a lot of singles for roll. Not the sort of stuff you want to be doing at this time in the morning. And this is all really difficult stuff. And it's this stuff that sort of impressed drummers in the 1960s. Everybody took what they could from it. Now, a contemporary of Tony Williams is the drummer I've now got at number 8, which is my hero, and that's Billy Cobham. Billy Cobham, if you go back to, say, 68, 69, when Billy Cobham's emerging, he hasn't got the sort of that sort of chops in terms of playing between the hands and the feet and putting the bass drum in. But what he has got over Tony is an incredible knowledge of rudimental playing. And in the Mavish Orchestra, he starts to chop time up rudimentally. Now, odd times have become a very important thing in the 1960s. Dave Brubeck had a huge hit with Take 5 with the great Joe Morello on drums, another drummer could easily be in on this list. And then Don Ellis had started to play all sorts of odd time signatures, and they were dividing the odd time signatures up in the sort of Western way, using crotchets to divide the time up. Billy Cobham starts to think of it in terms of the actual subdivisions itself. What do I mean by this? Because I think this is Billy's great innovation. If I was playing in 7, we would divide that up into 4 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Right? Now what Billy would do, he would take that 4 and he would go, well, what rudiments have I got? I've got a paradiddle. So rather playing the paradiddle here, he would play it between here, and that would be his 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So he's played 1, 2, 3, 4. So you got. And then when it comes to the 3, he may divide that up. Rather than dividing that up into 3, he would double the speed of that, make a 6, and then maybe play something like this. That's a paradiddle diddle maybe, or 6-stroke roll. So you would get a change in speed, a change in the way you are breaking up the time. So the 4 would be a paradiddle. Say we're in 7/8. This would be 4/8. So that's and then he would play 2 3s at double speed. Now what I've got there is a 2 paradiddle diddles. Right, 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 left, right, right, left, left. But he's playing them here between the hi-hat and the snare drum. So now we get this. Right, so I'm now going to lose the first paradiddle diddle of the 3, and I'm just going to play a rudiment of, right, which I will open the hi-hat on. Right, so you get. Fast. Now, of course, that's not the only innovation, but for me personally as a drummer, that was mind-blowing to have that idea of how to keep time from Billy Cobham. And I think it's hugely influential on modern drummers. When you listen to sort of technical drummers now, it's the way they are playing that 16th note based broken time and the way they are subdividing in it. They all do it. But Billy also played a lot of tom-toms. He tuned those toms up high. He had incredibly fast singles. He sort of really pushed the envelope in terms of really, explosive playing. And he played 2 bass drums. So when you watch a Neil Peart or you look at, Alex Van Halen, there's a lot of Billy Cobham in there. Now, of course, the double bass drums come from a big band jazz drummer called Louis Bellson. Louis Bellson was the drummer with Duke Ellington. So you could see a lot of these things originate in jazz, but Billy really, for me, was a huge influence. There's so many drummers, when I chat to them, he's the guy. Now, we have now got a number 9, an innovator on drums that emerges in the late 70s and I believe changes the sound of drums again. And this is Stewart Copeland. Now, Stewart Copeland was the drummer in the Police. He had grown up, his dad worked for the military, I think, or sort of the CIA or something like that, which I think is where the band name, The Police, came from. And he was growing up with all these African rhythms, and he started to apply those to the drum kit in a reggae context. It's not just reggae drumming. Reggae employs a thing called the one drop. So you get, but they often drop that on the 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. That combined with some of the weird rhythms Stewart had in his head, and then a different concept to drum tuning. Really tuning the drums up, to utilize the mics. I mean, I wish I could speak more about how production changes technically what people are doing on the drums. Starts using splash cymbals, but he really changes the concept of the backbeat. So if we were just to take this 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, that's standard. But he might turn that around to get this 1, 2, 3, 4. Or even weird, he might go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 1, 2, 3, 4. So you get these really strange approaches to time. And a master of the hi-hat, the master of controlling the hi-hat, he gets so many different types of open hi-hats out of that. And that changes drumming. And you see all the jazz guys, right, by 1984, 85, all sound like that. If you listen to someone like Neil Peart, who is really coming out of drummers like Barrymore Barlow, Mitch Mitchell, Keith Moon to some extent, then suddenly by 1982, everything he's doing is coming straight out of Stewart Copeland. Stewart is the last great sound innovator, I believe, in drums, because at this point the machines start to take over. So you're probably going to wonder who I've got at number 10. Well, I am going to put at number 10 the guy that I think is the greatest living drummer at the moment, which is, of course, Vinnie Colaiuta. Now, I've got to sit here and try and tell you what Vinnie did on the drums. Now, if you take Tony Williams and you take some of the polyrhythmical aspects of Tony Williams and the way he plays technically, you know, between hands and feet and all that type of stuff, but you also take Steve Gadd, who takes a sort of parallel Billy Cobham approach, a rudimental approach to drums, and you mix those two styles together, you sort of get Vinnie Colaiuta. But Vinnie's spell in Zappa's band, he became very interested in polyrhythms. What do we mean by polyrhythms? Well, say if we've got a time of, say, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Over the top of that, I can put a 3. Now this creates almost like a parallel tempo within the music. I will now put a 4 over it, which fits much more neatly. Now I'm going to play a 5 over 2, and this is very, very difficult. And this gives us another sort of tempo. It sort of takes time and expands it into 4 dimensions. So here's a 5 over the 2. So if you're keeping time like this, you can go. Now, Elvin was doing this, a whole bunch of drummers were doing this, but Vinnie takes it to a new level, combined with the sort of virtuosity that we've been talking about. And he, I was very influenced by him because when he solos, his time he has like the whole palette of tempos all related to the time. So you get stuff like that way of playing was hugely influential on mine because it frees you up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. So that way of being able to bend the time. Now, he's number 10 on the list. Something that influenced me, which I'm going to finish off with, is this idea of, goes right back to Dee Dee Chandler, the idea of the bass drum and the coordination that goes with it. In the 1960s, Max Roach, who didn't make my list, he did a tune called The Drum Also Waltzes, where he plays a 3/4 pattern with his feet like this. And then he plays against it. Now this was massively influential on me, and also influential on a drummer called Terry Bozzio, who in the 1980s took ostinato playing and took it to another level. In the early 2000s, I started to do drum clinics, and that Vinnie Colaiuta approach to polyrhythms combined with this ostinato was something that I was exploring at the time, and so was a whole bunch of other drummers. And I'm going to finish up doing a little bit of that. So I'm going to play a foot pattern that's in 6, and I'm probably going to go with this. So I'm going to go... that's the pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we get this. Now what I did then, I used polyrhythms over the top of that. I did a 6 over the 6, which matches it, and then an 8 over the 6. I could put 5 over it if you wanted. So this was something that I started to explore myself, and I feel that this way of practicing, where you have foot in ostinatos and you use polyrhythms and time signatures, that's basically my sort of basic practice foundation. If anyone's interested in this, I would love to be pulling together some sort of drum course which goes through my method of developing technique, and if people are interested in that, put it in the comments, because I might do it. So let's have a fiddle around with that first ostinato and see what we get. God knows what that was like. Tried my best. All one take.